This week, we tear open a topic that's burning through tech.
Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, are they broken beyond repair?
Just back from TED in Vancouver, things are brought to a boil.
This is Future Forward. I'm Gene DeRose.
And I'm Steve Rosenbaum, and let us launch. Hey, Gene.
Hey, how was TED? Wild?
Well, so I've been going for a long time, and years are different. Some years are very upbeat, some years are very hopeful, some years are more concerned about the end of the world. I would say for me, this year was almost entirely about the state of the country, the world, Britain, the UK, US, Canada, and how social media and technology has broken it. It was pretty intense, I got to say.
It Brexited itself.
Yeah. So what we're going to do on today's pod is kind of tear apart three big topics. Facebook first, and we'll talk about a TED Talk that led off the conference that Carol Wallander gave that was pretty startling. Then we'll talk about Twitter and Jack Dorsey's interview. And then we'll end on YouTube and in particular the Susan Wojcicki cover of the New York Times business section this week. All three of them different stories, but all three of them related and similar. So with that, maybe the best thing to do is just kind of jump into it because we got a lot to cover. I'm not even sure how to explain this.
Well, let me ask a question just quickly because I think, look, you were at TED, you're a TED veteran, and not a lot of people get there. And so you're bringing that in addition to just what happened. So we know that this woman, Susan Cadwallader of The Guardian, right? The Guardian? Spoke first and talked about how wrought things were. And then Jack spoke the next day. As you guys all got to TED, what was the vibe like? Were people knowing this was going to happen, and was there anticipation?
No, not at all. Mostly TED likes to float above the day-to-day politics of the moment and talk about bigger questions, bigger ideas, kind of bigger scientific, bigger philosophical, bigger issues. So the decision that Chris Anderson and his team made to put Carol at the top of the very first talk was not, was very purposeful. And
it felt like a bomb a little bit, or a different thing.
It felt like a bomb. And just to be blunt, journalists often don't make the best speakers. They often are either too passionate or too overwrought or too factual and driven by. The thing that made the Carol talk, and we'll play a little clip of it in a minute because I think it'll help our conversation. The thing that made the Carol talk so startling was that on one hand, she was so driven by the facts of the story she told, but also it was intensely personal. And I'll give you here's the précis. After the Brexit vote, she was a feature writer, and her editor said, go back to your hometown of Wales and cover who voted for this thing and why they voted for it. And so she arrived in this working class town that she hadn't been to in a very long time, and found a town that had been reborn with extraordinary technological accomplishments and a new sports center and all these kind of new construction, all of which was funded by the European Union. And so she started asking people why they'd voted to leave. And what she found was that they all were upset about immigration and immigrants and Turkey joining the EU and a whole variety of things, none of which were true. There were, as she, yeah.
And much like the U.S. working class, who had long been bastions of kind of liberal and social progress in voting and welfare state stuff, they had kind of been flipped.
Yeah, and so what she found very quickly was that every one of the voters that she spoke to had been influenced not by their community and not by the world around them, but by Facebook.
But then after the article came out, this woman got in touch with me. And she was from Ebbw and she told me about all this stuff that she'd seen on Facebook. I was like, what stuff? And she said it was all this quite scary stuff about immigration, especially about Turkey. So I tried to find it, but there was nothing there. Because there's no archive of ads that people had seen, or what had been pushed into their news feeds. No trace of anything. It had gone completely dark.
Right. And they were very explicitly promoting completely false things, like Turkey's about to enter the EU, which is completely not true, and that, we're being invaded by, foreigners, when the percentage of people in her old town that are foreign born are like insanely small, so kind of crazy fact acceptance on no basis.
Well, she points out with great clarity that the UK has rules about how much money you can spend on elections, but that when she went looking to find out who was buying ads on Facebook and who was promoting this conversation, that information was entirely unavailable to her. And as the talk grows, one of the things that becomes clear is that and she talks about Facebook in terms of the Brexit vote as a crime scene. And she doesn't mean that to be kind of cute language. She's not saying that to be kind of like, controversial. She actually means, people bought ads on Facebook, lied to the British public, the British voted, and they voted based on misinformation that was purposefully targeted at them.
Right. And what's extraordinary to me is the Russian and other, hacking and persuasion efforts for Brexit are often talked about as like a test run for destroying the U.S. election and Trump. But to me, the UK breaking from the European Union is far more consequential and significant longer term. And so I didn't realize the extent of that. I did not realize that such a close vote was almost certainly turned by this.
Yeah. TED is not a monolithic organization. And so, often, there are Republicans, there are Democrats, there are lots of libertarians. So often with a TED audience, complicated issues are not, there's not a black and white, we all agree, we all disagree. But in this case, I think the audience was pretty much shocked by the way she told the story and almost entirely kind of in line with her concern.
But just to be clear, this wasn't like breaking a story, right? This is a story she broke a long time ago, but maybe got much more attention in the UK. One of the things that is completely indicting that she mentioned was that while some very shady people attempted or threatened to file lawsuits, Facebook tried to stop publication of her breaking this story.
Yeah, it was honestly a talk that just kept unfolding. And the other thing, by the way, and this is maybe the clue about TED Talks, is she was both very factual, quite carefully factual, but also clearly emotionally stung by the story. And she said at one point, I was a feature reporter, not an investigative reporter. Like this story landed on her kind of doorstep.
Right. And she came out of it, or at least presented herself pretty directly from the video, almost looking back at herself as a journalist and being an advocate for change that has to happen. And look, let's step back, because we're going to talk about Jack as well here in Twitter. The net of it to me is that, of course, this technology has evolved so far that there are things that have almost gotten beyond our control, but it's also very explicitly an indictment, at least in this sense, of Facebook, which could have done more, which could have been more transparent, which could have been more focused on the consequences of that, rather than, having a blind eye to it for business purposes.
I also, just by the way, as I'm looking at the TED page now as we record this podcast, it's got almost 900,000 views on that talk. So the next thing, by the way, and this is important, all of the talks that get recorded at the TED conference, they record many, many, many talks over the course of the week. And then they go into post-production, they clean them up, they clean the audio up, they choose whether or not they're going to cut away to the audience for various shots, and they get released over the course of a year.
Right.
This talk was released the next day.
Right, along with the other one we're about to talk about.
Yeah. So clearly the editorial team at TED understood the importance of this talk, and Carol, to her credit, worked very hard to deliver it. It all comes down to, by the way, let's make sure we don't miss the important headline. It all comes down to Cambridge Analytica. I mean, really, it's finding persuadable audiences on Facebook and then delivering to them terrifying messages that literally scare them into becoming a voting bloc.
Right. So, to flesh that out, using the Facebook data on these 80 million plus, I can't remember, to understand what it is that frightens and angers them emotionally, and then using those visceral, inflections to put their information and what they wanted persuasion on into that sort of vector, right? Yes. Like unbelievably crafted. And what she also made very clear to me was there's sort of Cambridge Analytica and a deep overlap between both how engaged and how much that was used by both the U.S. and the British influencers. Right.
You know what? I meant to get to this sooner, but let's just pause here for a second and let her speak for 15, 20 seconds, just so you can get a sense of her cadence and also something important she has to say.
I don't have to tell you that hate and fear are being sown online all across the world. Not just in Britain and America, but in France and in Hungary and Brazil and Myanmar and New Zealand. And we know that there is this dark undertow which is connecting us all globally, and it is flowing via the technology platforms. But we only see a tiny amount of what's going on the surface.
All right, so we're back. I can only tell you in the room, and you nailed it at the top of the pod. It was literally like a bomb dropped.
Interesting.
I mean, you could feel the sometimes, just to be blunt, 18 minutes is a long time. Sometimes TED Talks feel, at least for me, I'm like, okay, I got the point, moving on. Other times they're incredibly gripping, and in this case, she had us. We weren't going anywhere, and it literally fueled the entire week. And by the way, she stayed all week.
Wow.
So she literally had 100, 300 conversations with people, all of whom essentially, I'm guessing, said to her, what do we do?
Well, I think, right, exactly. And before we dive into, because I do think that the talk with Jack Dorsey of Twitter and what the outcome of that is in terms of what they're trying to do and what should be done, that's where those two stories kind of blend together, at least in terms of what our point of view is on what is or isn't being addressed and should or shouldn't be. So before diving into it, let me just ask you another sort of circumstantial question. how soon after she spoke did Jack spoke? Because I would imagine the whole room, the whole place then started zeroing in on what obviously was going to happen with Jack speaking.
So Jack was the next day. Jack was Tuesday.
So there was a day for it to sort of simmer.
Yeah, and or more than simmer, boil.
Right.
So 90% of the talks are given on stage by a single speaker, direct to the audience, prepared, written, often with slides, sometimes with video. Jack chose, and I don't know, I don't have the inside scoop on how this was determined, but Jack chose to be interviewed by Chris Anderson and by the newly named head of current affairs at TED, who also was terrific.
And it's a good thing because it needed to be directed, and who knows if he would or wouldn't have been so on it.
Well, so the woman who sat next to Chris her name is Whitney Pennington Rogers, and she's the new current affairs curator for TED. It's a fair question. I'll give you my bias. My bias is preparing a TED Talk is very challenging and time consuming, and memorizing it and getting the cadence right. And there's a lot of kind of like you have to deliver it. An interview is way easier, and I think you get points off for coming ill prepared. And now you get points for coming if you're Jack Dorsey, but you get points off for not taking the time to think about that audience and that world stage and deliver thoughts as opposed to answers.
Well, look, you may know, but to me, there's missing information about how it was all put together and structured. I ran conferences for a while, and something at a much lower scale happened a few times. And in producing, conscious moves were made, right? Like this bombshell is going to drop, whether, he may have known in advance. Like if I was him, if I was running one of those indicted even indirectly, I would, unless I was completely out of my depth, I would want a chance to respond and address it. And so whatever, who knows whether it happened or what was conscious or not, but the serendipity of it lining up, I think made it pretty damn good.
All right, so there are three things we have to talk about. I want to talk first about his appearance and kind of demeanor, and then we'll talk about the TED decision to have people online question him in real time, which was interesting. And then we'll talk about Chris's bombshell question, which was absolutely a bombshell. And
right, the overall subject of all this stuff. Go on, sorry.
So he showed up wearing a black hoodie, kind of a scraggly beard, and a knit cap pulled down tight over his ears, and looked kind of like a crazy homeless person.
Or if he was, deep in Brooklyn or Milan, extremely hip.
Nah, a little more callow and exhausted than that. But also, if you read the Twitter sphere or whatever, I mean, he eats one meal a day and drinks a bone. I don't know. It's like he's got a whole diet thing going that I mean, maybe that's a way to be healthy, but he's an
OCD startup monk. He definitely has his own very, very specific way he does things.
Yeah. So the thing that kind of, it started out pleasant enough. Both Chris and Whitney asked some questions. He basically gave standard PRE answers. It felt like maybe it was going to go that way. And then Chris did something surprising. He said to the audience, there's a whole no phones in the auditorium rule. And he changed it for this and said, everyone take out your phones. And he put up a hashtag. I think it was Ask Jack at TED or something like that. And he said to the audience, you can pose questions and we'll answer them. We'll pull some of them out of the feed. Two things happened almost immediately. The questions went up on either side of him. And let's just pause for a minute here and show you just a bit of the kind of the bubbling under questioning that comes up, because I think it's relevant.
Jack, just picking up on some of the questions flooding in here, just like
I didn't answer the question.
A lot of people puzzled why, like, how hard is it to get rid of Nazis from Twitter?
So we have policies around violent and extremist groups, and the majority of our work and our terms of service works on conduct, not content.
All right, so the questions were thoughtful, they were ponderous, they were inquisitive, but very quickly they extended beyond the TED Hall, because the minute you're posting on Twitter, Ask Jack at TED, real people started, and so it became something of a shit show rather quickly, and so seeing Jack sit in that chair, surrounded by screens of people essentially, being inquisitors, was kind of futuristic and scary. And fairly quickly, the questions kind of went off the rails, and they stopped using them. But a lot of them, the questions
sounds Kafkaesque almost. It sounds almost like bad old cinema with someone with words behind them, and he's spinning around. And
yeah. By the way, this was not a surprise to Jack. It was in the spirit of the Reddit Ask Me Anything idea, and clearly he agreed to it. But I'm not sure anyone really thought about how quickly it would go off the rails. And a lot of the questions, the ones I saw anyway, were things like, isn't Trump in violation of your terms of service? Like, yeah. Why do you allow Trump to have a platform on your service?
Well, look, I'll just say this because, I watched it. From a video point of view, it didn't seem as crazy as it must have felt in the room. It must have been dramatic. A, and B, I think his particular almost lizard-like, demeanor, and honestly, I think he was articulate and thoughtful in addressing and conceding. Like, he didn't come off freaked out or panicked. I just don't feel very positive about the things he was saying.
So Chris, as he was kind of ramping up to ask the hard question, described him as idiosyncratic.
Yes.
And I was trying to think of what the less polite word for that would be. Like weird, like freaky, like.
Well, he would call himself kind of an OCD kind of control freak. He regiments his day by the hour and literally does this for an hour, that for an hour, that for an hour, and has
By the way, like any other CEO in America, though, I'm sorry, that's
no, in a completely balkanized, like he's out of control. People have described what his days are like and how he manages his way through a week, being CEO of two different companies. People say it's astonishing, like they've never seen before.
Well, so I call bullshit on one thing that he certainly said, and then we'll get to Chris's inquisition in a moment. He gave this speech about how Whitney asked him if it was hard to be the CEO of both Square and Twitter, and whether or not maybe Twitter being so important, it ought to have one CEO instead of half a CEO. And he answered, well, it's all about his team, and he's got a really good team of executives, and I happen to call bullshit on that because I know of eight people or nine that are have been fired or quit.
Yeah, and look, if he's that good too, then I want twice of him, right? If he's my CEO, right? It's not about just because he can do it as well as a B- CEO or whatever it is. I can get both jobs done. I don't find that enough. And by the way, I find that consistent with a thread that he kept talking about over and over again, which was not challenged. It was challenged a little bit about this or that has to be scalable. It has to be, getting it right does not mean it has to be scalable. It's about getting it right, even if you got to put 1,000 people on it. He never used a number in terms of editorial or hands-on human. He just kept talking in contextual senses and relative, more or less, when we need it.
All right, so let's get to the highlight of this, because it of all the conversations over the course of the week, to me, this was the thing that was the headline from that day, and that was Chris said to him,
"We're on this great voyage with you on this ship called the Titanic, and there are people on board in steerage who are expressing discomfort, and you, unlike many other captains, are saying, well, tell me, talk to me, listen to me, I want to hear. And they talk to you and they say, we're worried about the iceberg ahead. And you go, that is a powerful point. And our ship, frankly, hasn't been built properly for steering as well as it might. And we say, please do something. And you go to the bridge, and we're waiting. And we look in, and you're showing this extraordinary calm. But we're all standing outside saying, Jack, turn the fucking wheel. I mean...
And Dorsey kind of cocked his head and thought for a moment and said, well, we could act quickly, but this is a really complicated problem, and we really want to build it for the long-term solution, and we're really trying to understand the role of humans. And it was a bullshit answer.
Yeah, I agree. And look, the details that preceded that, I felt it was insane. If we did this again, we wouldn't have focused on how many followers you had. Maybe people should be following topics instead of people. Maybe likes shouldn't be such a big deal. Like, I feel like he was talking about things that were the core of why Twitter actually is so good and important. I mean, I really felt like this was not addressing things. And I also want to make one other point that I wonder what your point of view is, there's two things that are different, even if they're overlapping, in terms of the problems people are looking at. And I feel like they're conflated. Abuse and outrageous behavior and extreme dialogue and tweets and harming others, that's its own kind of thing. That is very different than inappropriate, persuasive means through untruths changing people's minds. They're talking over and over again about weeding out abusive behavior and extreme statements. Well, to say Brexit should happen is not necessarily an extreme statement. Like, you're not addressing, these are different things, right?
Yeah. So
the politics versus the personal abuse stuff.
So we want to make sure we have time for YouTube, which is our next and last chapter of the show. Yeah. But I'm gonna tell you my thesis coming out of sitting in the audience, and that is, Jack does not own Twitter. Jack is a CEO. There's a board of directors. I do not know their names, but I can Google them, and you can Google them, and we know they're all Valley well-known people. I think that if there is not a conversation back channel at the board level happening that says, maybe we really need somebody who's working full time on this problem, I'm shocked. And I think it's important that the board members names come out. I'll dig up a link of what they are. We'll put them in the pod notes, because these are people that have a fiduciary and a moral responsibility to not hit the iceberg if you're on the Titanic. And let's Chris is an incredibly thoughtful and careful editor and curator, and for him to frame the problem in those stark and visual terms, it should concern us all. I mean,
yeah.
Anyway.
Well, look, I think we may have to devote an issue more directly to sort of the substance of the content and the what are we going to do, and are we reaching a point? Because obviously we have to move through this, but they're really important issues. And I think you nailed one thing that goes to Facebook and the other guys too. The role of the board of directors in all this, and where the culpability, and to me it applies to Facebook too. I know you're talking more about does Jack have the resources as a human to be the CEO? But it's more than that. I feel like these boards have to own the damage as much as the CEOs do.
Well, all right. So we don't have to spend very much time on YouTube. YouTube, the Susan Wojcicki, because it'll come to a conclusion I'd like to draw. I mean, they essentially spent time with her and watched her sit in meetings trying to, play whack-a-mole on objectionable content and say, well, is this more objectionable than that? And they gave some very stark examples of videos, and were they life-threatening? Were they dangerous? What I came away from this week with. And what I'm thinking a lot about now and in the future, frankly, is if Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube all have versions of the same problem, what do they have in common?
Well, that's actually a really good question. I think it's easier to start in some ways with what they don't have in common, because YouTube is different in that it is this sort of closed publication mode. Like the videos themselves are kind of, even though there's comments and threads underneath, that's what has the life. Whereas on Twitter and Facebook, the dialogue and the content and whether the article that's linked to, right, there's a whole kind of, they're both so much more inherently social than YouTube. And so I do think in some ways YouTube is the most Wild West uncontrollable thing. I don't know how they ever could manage this.
So I have a theory, and I want to present it to you. I think the problem is one word, and I think the problem is free. And I'll tell you why I feel that way. Think about your email. Think about the amount of garbage spam you get. Why do you get so much spam? Because it costs nothing for a marketer or a spammer to send you garbage information. Cost literally $0, and it costs nothing to post. So the more I think about it, not only did Gmail make it impossible for anyone to run a paid business in email because free is so compelling, but secondly, it makes it impossible. It essentially gives bad actors a leg up. And I think that's true on Twitter, and I think that's true on Facebook, and I think it's true on YouTube, because, not to use an old truism, but I'll use one, if you're not paying for the product, then you're the service.
Well, look, I actually think you're coming from a different direction, but as I used to get laughed at when I was at Jupiter overseeing the analysts, they always liked when I said, I couldn't disagree with you more. And look, I think that it's easy to hear what you're saying or what Jaron Lanier said a year ago in an article that we're partly referencing. That's like putting the hands completely in Citizens United. That's like saying pay to play. Oh, sure. That is, it's anti-democratic to do that. I just, and I also don't believe in the substance of whether that would solve anything. Like, I get that it reduces the ability for the rabble to just chime in and pile on, but
no, but it's worse than that, to overwhelm normal people. Like, but money is going to cause more overwhelming than just the chattering of everyone. All right. Well, unfortunately, we are out of time.
We are. Oh man, that's too bad.
Yeah,
we can go on this one, but but I understand where you're coming from, and this is something we should talk about more.
All right. So we'll do an episode called "Is Free Fucked?" And we'll use Jaron as the launching off point, because that is.
Let me just ask for 30 seconds more on. So after Jack spoke, and how did everyone just leave and go home in a daze, or was there a kind of feeling beyond that of what's the next step at TED? Hard to say.
Yeah, no. I mean, he was in the middle of the morning, and there was a whole day of other things to talk about. There were lots of conversations, but I will say this as an analysis: it was the first time that I thought you could make a fair argument that most everyone in the community, no matter their politics or their belief system or where they came from in the world, agreed that the web utopian view of we'll all share everything on the web and it'll all sort itself out clearly seems nostalgic and like a failed premise now. And that's the first time I felt that way.
That's really interesting. All right. Well, we'll pick this up in many ways in the future.
We are out of time. Thank you, Gene. Thanks, everybody. We will be back again with another episode next week of Future Forward. Till then,
onward.
Onward.
Bye.